right. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open to John chapter 10. We'll be reading the same verses as the previous readings. I'm always a little worried when I come up here and speak that people are going to take what I say as gospel. Partly because I'm reading out of the gospel, but also because I, like so many preachers, preach with authority. I have studied this book all of my life. I've gone to college to learn about it. I have dedicated my life to it. So it comes as no surprise that when I read the Bible, I have very strong opinions. But nothing I say should be taken as gospel. And here in John chapter 10, Christ tells us exactly that. I am not the final arbiter of what is gospel. Jesus tells us, I tell you the solemn truth, the one who does not enter by the sheepfold, or enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. Now, do I look well put together today? Do I look like I spent a good amount of time on my appearance? I'm not like those televangelists, at least. I don't have a Rolex watch. I don't have a $1,000 suit. I didn't come here by private jet. But that doesn't mean that the words that I preach to you are any more authoritative than those who are, by their very livelihood, thieves and robbers. But that's how Jesus tells us to recognize them. Just look at them. How'd they get in here? How are they presenting themselves? Did they come in through the front door? Honest people come in through the front door, and they present themselves honestly. He says, the one who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. The doorkeeper opens the door for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. Does that televangelist know your name? You write a check to him. Does he know your name? Well, thankfully, Jesus does. When he has brought all his own sheep out, he goes ahead of them. And that's important. Jesus goes ahead of us. And the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. The most dangerous place to be is right in front. You never know what's going to be on the other side of that door. But the shepherd takes on that responsibility. And we follow him because we recognize his voice. The fact is, if it doesn't sound like Jesus, if it doesn't sound like love and peace and truth, it's not Jesus. This is how Jesus tells us to recognize him. He says they never follow a stranger, but will run away from him because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. Jesus told them this parable, but they didn't understand what he was saying to them. They are just sheep after all. So Jesus said again, I tell you the solemn truth, I am the door for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers. Now, I think this is interesting because Jesus quotes a lot of people in his preaching. He quotes Moses. He quotes Isaiah. He quotes Aesop's fables. He quotes Buddha. But he says of all of them, they were Buddha. But he says of all of them, they were all thieves and robbers. Is that really what he's saying? Now, I've been taught that. I don't believe that. But keep in mind, when Jesus lived, he lived in a time of lots and lots of false messiahs. He lives in the time just after the Maccabees, when the Maccabees have driven out the Greek Empire with the help of the Romans. And don't you know they were the messiahs for a little while until the Romans came. And then they needed another messiah. And there were all sorts of them in Jesus' day. And afterwards, for 100 years after Jesus, there were false messiahs until the Bar Kokhba revolt, the final false messiah, who was such a bad messiah that he got all the Jews kicked out of Jerusalem. And they weren't allowed to go back except on festival days. When Jesus is saying, I'm the good shepherd, the other ones are thieves and robbers, he's not talking about Moses. He's not talking about Buddha, as we're sometimes told from the pulpit. He is talking about other messiahs. He's talking about people who stand up there in their $1,000 suits and says, do you need salvation? For the low, low price of $19.95, it can be yours, and we'll throw in a complimentary set of Ginsu knives. That's who he's talking about. He's talking about the people who go up there and say, do you feel bad about yourself? Do you have low testosterone? Do you need another bottle of snake oil? We'll sell you another bottle of snake oil. He's talking about the false messiahs. He's saying, listen to their claims. Does it sound like love and peace and community and truth? If it doesn't, that's not the self-help book you need. He tells them, I tell you the solemn truth, I am the door for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. And he will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and may have it abundantly. Thing is, when Jesus came, he came and partied with sinners. His first miracle was turning water into wine. He's not kidding about living life and living it abundantly. He isn't talking about going off and joining a monastery and living a solitary and ascetic life. He is talking about having fun on Saturday nights. He is talking about living a life of joy and peace. And it starts not with sending your $20 to that televangelist who came to rob and steal and buy his private jet. It comes from building a community that comes together to have joyous celebrations, or that comes together to mourn our mutual losses, or to hold one another accountable in times when we are struggling. To be a community of joy and peace and hope. That's what he's talking about when he talks about pasture. That's what he means when he says, have life and have it abundantly. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not a shepherd and does not own sheep, sees the wolf coming and abandons the sheep and runs away. How many churches have we been to that when they see that there's trouble coming for the LGBT community, they say, well, you know what? We never really liked them anyways. When they see that their pews are full of racists, who do they side with? They side with the racists. When they see that their pews are full of people who want to turn out widows and orphans and refugees, who do they side with? Well, whoever pays them, because they're just hired hands. And I hope we are never that kind of church. Because even if I'm on the payroll, I'm still just a sheep. And it takes a sheep to look out there and say, those people who are vulnerable, those people who half the congregation have decided, you know what, they're just too risky. The homeless people in the back pew, they're just too risky. The ones with a drug or alcohol or addiction or domestic abuse problem, they're just too needy. But they're sheep just like us. We can't turn away sheep. We can turn away hired hands. He says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not come from this sheepfold. I must bring them too, and they will listen to my voice, so that there will be one flock and one shepherd. Notice he doesn't say how many groups of sheep there are. He doesn't say there's two groups of sheep. There's this group and that group. There's the insiders and the outsiders. He doesn't say how many. He says there's the sheep in this sheepfold, and then there are sheep elsewhere. And guess what? I'm going to keep bringing in those strange sheep that you don't know. The ones that don't eat the things that you eat. The ones that have strange problems that we don't understand. And I'm going to keep bringing them in until this one is packed and there's no outsiders left. So that there will be one flock and one shepherd. Now we go on to John chapter 15. He tells the same story, but another way. And John places the emphasis in a different place than every other gospel here. Here, Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Now, you're familiar with the synoptics where he says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Here he places the emphasis in a totally different place. Just like Jesus is the good shepherd, he says now, I am the true vine. It's an interesting emphasis to me. It means there are other vines. But Jesus is the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He takes away every branch that does not bear fruit in me. He prunes every branch that bears fruit so that it will bear more fruit. I don't know if you have fruit trees, but I do. And if you want a branch to bear more fruit, prune it. You prune it back until it's just one straight branch, and it'll put out more branches. But every year I prune the trees back to where there's just a few little straight branches, and they produce more and more fruit every year. But that tree looks so sad at the end of it, let me tell you, because it has been thoroughly disciplined. All the little spider hovels have been cleared out of it. Every branch is just totally available to sunlight because there aren't any in front of the other branches. There aren't any that are just tucked away in the middle. There aren't any hidden. And that's what he's talking about here when he says that God will prune us. God will prepare us for the work that he has for us. And here he says, you are clean already because of the word that I have spoken to you. Now, this is interesting to me because I've been taught that we are clean when we're baptized and that we are clean forevermore from that point on. Here Jesus says that you are clean already because of the word I have spoken to you. And he says, remain in me and I will remain in you, just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it remains in the vine. so neither can you unless you remain in me. And I think that's interesting because he places the emphasis on receiving the word and remaining faithful. It's not on the singular act of baptism. And I think of the Great Commission when I think of baptism, of Matthew 28:18, which I brought up here because I was afraid of misquoting it. It says, "Then Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age.'" And in that, he says the same thing, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. That's the word remaining in you. And remember, I am with you always. And there's us remaining in him. But baptism is for the remission of sins, like it says in Acts 2:38. Well, that's true. It is. But it's the only place we see that. And so Jesus tells us it's not enough that you do this one thing and then you're saved, you're good forever. Go do what evil deeds you need to go do. He says, no, you must remain in me. He says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him bears much fruit, because apart from me you can accomplish nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is thrown out like a branch and dries up, and such branches are gathered up and thrown into the fire and are burned up. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you want and it will be done for you. My Father is honored by this, that you bear much fruit and show that you are my disciples." So what's the point of the fruit? It shows that we're his disciples. Because the branches that don't belong to him don't bear fruit. Just as the Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Remain in my love. If you obey my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commandments and remain in his love. This is the point. Paul gives us a list of 9 fruits of the Spirit, but Jesus here tells us there's one. Just love. All of these fruits are summed up by love. He says, I've skipped a bit. "I have told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. My commandment is this, to love one another just as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, that one lays down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you." And he only gave us the one commandment, to love. "I no longer call you slaves, because the slave does not understand what his master is doing, but I have called you friends." Remember, these are his disciples. They call him master. And so he says, I no longer call you slaves. They've placed themselves in slavery by discipling themselves to Jesus. But he says, I no longer call you slaves, but I call you friends, because I have revealed to you everything I heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit that remains, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. This I command you, to love one another. So here, Jesus tells us how we recognize him by his voice, by his commandments. If he's not telling us to love, it's not Jesus. If it doesn't sound like love, that's not Jesus. If we don't live in love, we aren't his disciples. This isn't his community. But if we live in love and we preach love to one another and to the world, then we are children of God. And it really is that simple. Do you know people that don't call themselves Christians, but they live in love? Do you know people who call themselves Christians and they don't live in love? It's not the name that matters. God said to Moses on Mount Sinai, when Moses asked him, "When I go back to the Israelites, who should I say sent me?" He said, "I am that I am." That's not a name. I am is not a name. It's what Popeye the Sailor says. But it's exactly what God is. Because God is love. And so it doesn't matter what we call God, so long as we call him love. It's like God saying, call me anything you want, just don't call me late for dinner. Just call me love. That's all I want to be. And that's how I want you to live.